The gravel truck rumbled to a stop, its massive hydraulic arm poised like a prehistoric beast ready to strike. Margaret Holloway, known to everyone in Pinewood Estates as the most feared HOA board member, watched in absolute horror as 20 tons of crushed stone began to cascade directly onto her midnight blue BMW 7 Series. Her pearl-white silk blouse billowed in the sudden dust cloud, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair now a tragic mess of gray-white debris. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. It all started 3 weeks earlier when Margaret, or HOA Karen, as the residents secretly called her, had unilaterally declared that the guest parking spaces in Pinewood Estates were critically underutilized. Her solution? Repurpose individual homeowners' driveways as supplementary guest parking, with homeowners receiving zero compensation or choice in the matter. For most residents, this would have been an inconvenience. For Daniel Reynolds, the man now orchestrating the gravel assault, it was a declaration of war. Daniel was not your typical suburban homeowner. A 42-year-old former military logistics specialist turned independent software consultant, he understood strategy, documentation, and most importantly, revenge. When Margaret had personally sent him a registered letter demanding he allow random strangers to park in his meticulously maintained driveway, something inside him snapped. He had studied the HOA bylaws more carefully than Margaret herself. He knew every comma, every legal nuance. And he knew that while she wielded power through intimidation, he possessed something far more dangerous: patience and precision. The first step had been gathering evidence. Daniel installed high-resolution cameras that captured every interaction, every violation, every overreach. He documented Margaret's constant rule-bending, her selective enforcement, her tyrannical micromanagement of the neighborhood's aesthetic. Neighbors who had suffered under her reign watched in a mixture of terror and anticipation. Margaret had fined people for grass blades being 1/8 of an inch too long. She had forced the Rodriguez family to repaint their house 3 times because the shade of beige was not within the approved spectrum. She had once measured a garden gnome with a literal ruler to ensure it met neighborhood height restrictions. Now, as the gravel continued to pour onto her luxury vehicle, Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish desperately seeking oxygen. Her weekly manicured nails, always a pristine French tip, were covered in dust and small stone fragments. Daniel had planned this moment with military-like precision. He had obtained all necessary permits. He had ensured every legal requirement was met. The gravel truck was precisely positioned, its delivery completely within local construction and landscaping regulations. And most importantly, he had Margaret's own bureaucratic paperwork to thank for this moment of sublime justice. The neighborhood held its collective breath. Margaret Holloway's reign of HOA terror was about to meet its spectacular finale. The aftermath of the gravel incident was nothing short of nuclear warfare in suburban social dynamics. Within hours, Margaret's BMW, now a tragic monument to bureaucratic overreach, became the most discussed topic in Pinewood Estates' digital and physical spaces. Daniel knew the real battle was just beginning. Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight, and her first strike came precisely 47 minutes after the last stone settled on her crushed vehicle. A legal document arrived via certified mail, its crisp white envelope practically vibrating with rage. Margaret had filed an emergency complaint with the HOA board, demanding an immediate hearing and seeking damages for what she described as willful destruction of private property and intentional harassment. What she didn't know was that Daniel had been preparing for this moment for months. His home office looked more like a war room than a typical suburban workspace. Meticulously organized binders lined custom-built shelves, each one containing documented evidence of Margaret's HOA tyranny. Spreadsheets mapped out every fine, every complaint, every selective enforcement she had ever issued. Color-coded tabs marked specific infractions with digital backups stored in multiple secure locations. The Rodriguez family, longtime victims of Margaret's architectural perfectionism, had become unexpected allies. Carlos Rodriguez, a civil engineer with a photographic memory for bureaucratic details, had been collecting his own documentation. When Daniel had approached him 6 months earlier, sharing his plan to systematically challenge Margaret's power, Carlos had been more than willing to help. She made us repaint her entire house because the beige was 2 shades off her precious color wheel, Carlos had told Daniel during their first strategy meeting. 2 shades, can you believe that? Now, as Daniel reviewed the emergency HOA hearing notice, he allowed himself a small smile. Margaret had no idea what was coming. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the community center's main hall, a space Margaret had personally selected for its intimidating fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable plastic chairs. She clearly expected to steamroll the proceedings as she had done countless times before. But Daniel had other plans. He spent the next 3 days preparing. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced, each argument meticulously crafted. He knew Margaret's playbook: divide and intimidate, use bureaucratic language to confuse and overwhelm, and he was about to turn her own tactics against her. The neighborhood watched and waited. Some residents were terrified of potential retribution. Others saw this as a potential turning point, a chance to finally stand up to the HOA's most notorious enforcer. Whispers spread through neighborhood group chats and over backyard fences. Screenshots of the gravel-covered BMW circulated like digital war propaganda. Daniel had become something of a folk hero, the man who dared to challenge the system. As Tuesday approached, tension in Pinewood Estates reached a fever pitch. Everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. A suburban showdown years in the making. Margaret Holloway might have ruled with an iron fist, but Daniel Reynolds was about to show her that every tyrant has a weakness, and he had found hers. The community center buzzed with an electrical tension rarely seen in suburban governance. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of expectant residents, their whispers creating a low, anticipatory hum. Margaret Holloway sat at the front table, her posture as rigid as the three-ring binder positioned precisely before her. Daniel arrived exactly 7 minutes before the meeting's start, carrying a leather portfolio that looked more like a strategic battle plan than a collection of documents. He nodded to Carlos Rodriguez, who sat strategically in the third row, a USB drive tucked discreetly in his jacket pocket. Margaret's opening statement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. This blatant act of vandalism represents a clear and present danger to our community's standards, she declared, her voice sharp enough to slice through the HOA community center air. Mr. Reynolds has not only destroyed private property but has undermined the very fabric of our neighborhood's governance. What she didn't know was that Daniel had been collecting ammunition for years. The first bombshell came when Daniel requested to review the original guest parking proposal. He produced meticulously annotated documents revealing a series of procedural violations that would make a government auditor weep. The proposal Margaret had pushed through had multiple technical errors that technically rendered the entire initiative null and void. But Daniel was just warming up. Carlos Rodriguez took the microphone next, presenting a comprehensive analysis of Margaret's selective enforcement. Spreadsheets revealed a disturbing pattern. Margaret's enforcement actions disproportionately targeted specific homeowners, those who had crossed her personally or challenged her authority. The Rodriguez family's case was particularly damning. They had been forced to repaint their house multiple times, incurring thousands of dollars in unnecessary expenses, while other homes with similar or worse violations received no citations. Daniel's evidence painted a picture of systematic harassment. Security camera footage, email chains, and meticulously documented communications told the story of a power-mad HOA board member who had long operated above the rules. Margaret's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Her perfectly manicured fingers, now slightly trembling, ripped the edge of the table. Beads of sweat formed at her temple, slowly destroying the immaculate makeup she'd applied that morning. The turning point came when Daniel presented a series of emails revealing Margaret's personal use of HOA resources. She had used the neighborhood's maintenance budget to trim the hedges at her personal property, a clear violation of the bylaws she had so zealously enforced against others. Ms. Holloway claims I've violated community standards, Daniel said, his voice calm and measured. But the evidence suggests a different narrative entirely. The room held its collective breath. Decades of pent-up frustration with Margaret's tyrannical rule seemed to crystallize in that moment. Neighbors who had suffered in silence now sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on Daniel. Margaret's legal strategy, always her most potent weapon, was crumbling before her eyes. The gravel-covered BMW was no longer the central issue. Instead, her entire approach to neighborhood management was now under microscopic examination. As the meeting approached its critical moment, one thing became clear. This was no longer just about a driveway or a buried BMW. This was a referendum on power, community, and the very nature of suburban governance. And Daniel Reynolds was about to deliver the final blow. The HOA board meeting descended into chaos, but not in the way Margaret had anticipated. Her carefully constructed world of bureaucratic control was unraveling thread by thread, with Daniel Reynolds methodically pulling each loose end. Jenna Winters, the youngest board member, was the first to break ranks. A junior attorney with a fresh perspective and zero tolerance for institutional bullying, she began examining the documentation Daniel had presented. Her fingers flew across her tablet, cross-referencing emails, bylaws, and financial records with surgical precision. These discrepancies are significant, Jenna announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Ms. Holloway, can you explain why multiple maintenance invoices show work performed at your personal residence, charged to the HOA's general fund? Margaret's face transformed, a canvas of rising panic barely concealed beneath a veneer of professional composure. Her trademark pearl necklace seemed to constrict around her throat, a physical manifestation of the pressure closing in. Daniel had prepared for this moment like a military strategist planning a complex operation. Each piece of evidence was carefully curated, each argument meticulously constructed. The USB drive Carlos Rodriguez had brought contained a treasure trove of documented infractions, a digital dossier that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. The neighborhood residents, who had long suffered under Margaret's tyrannical rule, began to whisper and shift in their seats. Years of pent-up frustration were finding their voice through Daniel's methodical takedown. Carlos Rodriguez leaned forward, sliding a supplementary document to Jenna. It was a comprehensive timeline of Margaret's selective enforcement, a damning chronicle of how she had used HOA rules as a personal weapon of control. Homeowners who had challenged her were mysteriously targeted with citations, while her personal friends received carte blanche for even more egregious violations. "Let's talk about the Rodriguez family," Daniel said, his voice calm and measured. "Forced to repaint their entire house because the beige was 2 shades off your approved color wheel. Meanwhile, the Hendersons have had peeling paint for 3 years with 0 consequences." Margaret's legal strategy, always her most potent weapon, was disintegrating in real time. The gravel-covered BMW was no longer just an isolated incident, but part of a larger narrative of systemic harassment and abuse of power. Jenna Winters began reading from the documentation, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. Financial irregularities, procedural violations, abuse of authority. The list was comprehensive and devastating. "I move for an immediate external audit of the HOA's financial records," Jenna declared, her declaration meeting with a chorus of murmured agreements from other board members. Margaret had always believed her position was untouchable. She had cultivated a reputation of fear and compliance, using bureaucratic language as a weapon to intimidate and control. But Daniel had found her fatal weakness: meticulous documentation and an unwavering commitment to exposing the truth. The community center felt electric, charged with a sense that something fundamental was changing. Years of quiet resentment were transforming into a collective moment of resistance. As the meeting approached its critical moment, Margaret Holloway, the once feared HOA Karen, looked smaller than she ever had before. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her, one documented infraction at a time. And Daniel Reynolds was just getting started. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Within 48 hours of the HOA meeting, Margaret Holloway found herself not just stripped of her board position, but facing a comprehensive investigation that would make an IRS audit look like a casual conversation. Her personal cell phone began to betray her. Text messages and emails that she believed were private became crucial pieces of evidence. Daniel had discovered something far more damaging than a simple bureaucratic overreach. He'd uncovered a systematic pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond neighborhood landscaping regulations. The first domino fell when the county tax assessor's office became interested in Margaret's financial records. Her husband, Richard, a commercial real estate broker with a reputation for aggressive dealings, was suddenly fielding uncomfortable questions about property transactions that didn't quite add up. Margaret's network of influence began to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The private school where she'd been a prominent fundraising chair suddenly requested her resignation. Her book club, a sacred social sanctuary, started removing her from group chats and email lists. Carlos Rodriguez was instrumental in transforming Daniel's initial complaint into a comprehensive review of HOA practices. His engineering background proved perfect for dissecting the bureaucratic maze Margaret had constructed. Each layer revealed another instance of selective enforcement, financial irregularities, and personal vendetta disguised as community management. It was never about the rules, Carlos explained to Daniel during a strategy session in his home office. It was about control. Margaret used the HOA as her personal fiefdom, and no one had the courage to challenge her. Until now. The Rodriguez family's story became particularly revealing. They had immigrated 15 years earlier, working tirelessly to establish themselves in the neighborhood. Margaret had systematically targeted them, using increasingly absurd citations to create financial and emotional pressure. The beige paint incident was just the tip of an insidious iceberg. Jenna Winters, the young attorney who had first challenged Margaret during the board meeting, took point on the legal investigation. Her youth and fresh perspective proved to be Margaret's ultimate weakness. Where previous board members had been intimidated, Jenna saw an opportunity to clean up a deeply corrupt system. Subpoenas began to arrive like unwelcome holiday cards. Margaret's carefully curated world started to disintegrate. Her husband, Richard, once a pillar of local real estate circles, found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once competed to sit next to him at charity events now avoided eye contact at local restaurants. The BMW, still buried under tons of gravel, became a symbol of Margaret's downfall. Neighbors would drive by, some taking photos, others simply shaking their heads in a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Daniel understood that this was about more than personal revenge. It was about restoring a sense of fairness to a community that had been systematically bullied and controlled. Each piece of evidence, each revealed infraction was a step toward rebuilding the neighborhood's sense of collective dignity. As Margaret's world continued to unravel, Daniel received an unexpected phone call. A local investigative journalist was interested in the story, not just as a neighborhood dispute, but as a broader examination of how small-scale bureaucratic tyranny operates in suburban America. The gravel was just the beginning, and Margaret Holloway was about to learn that revenge is a dish best served with meticulous documentation. The local newspaper's front page exposed hit like a tactical nuclear weapon in Pinewood Estates. Hell of a nightmare. One neighborhood's battle against bureaucratic tyranny, screamed the headline, accompanied by a full-color image of Margaret's gravel-entombed BMW. Richard Holloway's law firm began distancing themselves immediately. Partners who had once celebrated his aggressive real estate deals now treated him like a contagious disease. Lunch invitations dried up. Referrals vanished. The professional network he'd spent decades cultivating began to disintegrate faster than a sugar cube in hot tea. Margaret's response was Vintage Margaret, a desperate attempt to control the narrative through aggressive legal maneuvering. She filed a defamation lawsuit against Daniel Carlos Rodriguez and the local newspaper. What she didn't realize was that her lawsuit would become the final nail in her own coffin. Discovery proceedings are brutal, and Daniel had been preparing for this moment with the precision of a special forces operative planning a complex infiltration. Every email, every text message, every financial transaction was now subject to microscopic examination. The Rodriguez family's legal team, working pro bono with a fervor born of years of systematic harassment, began assembling a countersuit that would make scorched earth look like a gentle landscaping project. Jenna Winters, the young attorney who had first challenged Margaret, discovered something truly remarkable. The HOA's bylaws, those sacred texts Margaret had wielded like a medieval weapon, contained a series of archaic provisions that had been systematically ignored or manipulated over the years. It's like a legal archaeological dig, Jenna told Daniel during one of their strategy sessions. Each layer we remove reveals another instance of how Margaret bent the rules to suit her personal agenda. The most damning revelation came from an unexpected source. Margaret's own administrative assistant, a woman who had endured years of verbal abuse and impossible demands, contacted Daniel with a USB drive full of internal communications. It was a digital confession, a treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of calculated harassment and personal vendetta. Local media began to pick up the story. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was now a case study in suburban power dynamics. Podcasts, local news segments, even national outlets started exploring the broader implications of HOA governance. Carlos Rodriguez found himself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. His methodical documentation, a skill honed through years of professional engineering, became a blueprint for how ordinary citizens could fight back against institutional bullying. The BMW remained a powerful symbol. Visitors to Pinewood Estates would drive by, taking photographs of the gravel-covered luxury vehicle, a monument to one man's resistance and an entire neighborhood's liberation. Margaret's carefully constructed world continued to crumble. Her country club membership was revoked. Her charitable board positions vanished. The social network she had cultivated through years of strategic maneuvering collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Richard Holloway, once a pillar of local real estate, now spent his days fielding legal calls and trying to salvage what remained of his professional reputation. The power couple of Pinewood Estates had become its most notorious cautionary tale. Daniel understood this was about more than personal revenge. It was a systemic takedown, a toxic approach to community governance. Each revelation, each piece of evidence was a surgical strike against a system that had allowed people like Margaret to thrive. As the investigation deepened, one thing became clear. The BMW buried under 20 tons of gravel was just the beginning of Margaret Holloway's downfall. The legal proceedings transformed Pinewood Estates into a battlefield of suburban jurisprudence. Daniel Reynolds had become something of a local folk hero, the man who dared to stand up to the HOA's most notorious enforcer. But victory, he knew, was never as simple as it first appeared. Margaret's last-ditch effort came in the form of a countersuit so complex it resembled a labyrinth designed by a vengeful bureaucrat. She attacked Daniel's character, his property improvements, even the precise shade of his lawn's green. But each accusation only served to further expose her own pattern of harassment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Margaret's own mother. Eileen Hartley, a retired school principal with a no-nonsense attitude that made her daughter look positively diplomatic, contacted Daniel's legal team. She brought with her a collection of family documents that would become the final piece of the puzzle. "My daughter," Eileen explained during her deposition, her voice crisp and unapologetic, has always believed that rules were something to be manipulated, never followed. It started when she was a child, stealing my bridge club's raffle tickets, and it never stopped. The testimony was devastating. It wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute anymore, it was a comprehensive examination of a lifetime of systematic manipulation. Carlos Rodriguez continued to be instrumental. His engineering background proved perfect for dissecting the complex web of HOA regulations. He discovered a series of zoning violations that Margaret had conveniently overlooked, violations that primarily benefited her closest associates. The gravel-covered BMW had become more than just a symbol of resistance. It was now Exhibit A in a broader investigation into municipal governance and community power structures. Local universities began taking notice. Sociology departments saw the case as a perfect study of power dynamics in suburban communities. Law schools used the depositions as case studies in bureaucratic overreach. Richard Holloway's attempts to salvage his reputation became increasingly desperate. He reached out to old contacts, tried to leverage past relationships, but the network he'd spent decades building had evaporated overnight. The most ironic twist came when the state attorney general's office opened a formal investigation. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was now a matter of public interest. Jenna Winters, the young attorney who had first challenged Margaret, found herself at the center of a legal storm that was rapidly becoming a national conversation about community governance. This isn't just about one neighborhood, Jenna told a national news network. It's about how small-scale bureaucracies can become instruments of personal vendettas. Daniel understood the larger implications. This was never just about a driveway or a buried BMW. It was about challenging a system that had allowed petty tyrants to thrive unchecked. The Rodriguez family's journey became a testament to resilience. Years of systematic harassment had not broken them. Instead, it had forged them into instruments of change. As the legal proceedings continued, one thing became crystal clear. Margaret Holloway's reign of terror was over. The neighborhood she had controlled through fear was now writing its own rules. Rules of fairness, transparency, and genuine community. The BMW remained buried, a permanent monument to one man's resistance and an entire neighborhood's liberation.